On November 5th, 1274, 80 samurai stood on a beach in Tsushima, watching 900 ships emerge from the morning mist. 8,000 Mongol warriors prepared to land. By sunset, the beach would be littered with bodies, and something far more horrifying would decorate the Mongol fleet. Picture this: 80 mounted warriors, descendants of generations of samurai, gripping ancestral swords as they face odds of 100 to 1. The gateway to Japan itself hung in the balance. These men knew they would die. They knew their families would die. Yet not a single warrior fled. By the end of this video, you'll understand why these 80 men chose certain death over surrender, what revolutionary weapons shattered samurai tradition forever, and why the Mongols committed an act so horrific that it still haunts Japanese memory 7 centuries later. You're about to witness the moment honor codes met gunpowder for the first time, when the thundercrash bombs exploded on Japanese soil, horses reared in terror, and proud samurai who expected honorable duels found themselves cut down by arrow storms. You'll discover why samurai single combat became a death trap, how centuries of martial tradition crumbled in just 6 hours, and you'll learn about the grotesque warning that sailed from Tsushima's bloody shores, bodies displayed on ship hulls like macabre banners. How could the world's most disciplined warriors be swept aside in a single day? How did the Mongols turn samurai honor into a weapon against them? At the center of it all stood Governor So Sukekuni, the man they called the immovable rock. Korean emissaries had offered him escape. They begged him to evacuate, but Sukekuni refused, choosing instead to face the massive invasion force with his tiny garrison. To understand why these 80 men stood no chance, and why they fought anyway, we need to understand the collision of 2 worlds that forever changed the way humans wage war. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, where honor clashed with brutality and tradition met innovation, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Now, let me take you back to that fog-shrouded morning when the Mongol armada first appeared on Tsushima's horizon. The year 1274 found East Asia under the shadow of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and emperor of the Yuan dynasty. Korea had already fallen, its armies crushed, its shipyards now building vessels for the Khan's next ambition, Japan. The land of the rising sun had never faced foreign invasion. They were about to learn why the Mongol Empire stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. Tsushima Island sat just 50 kilometers from Korea, the lock on Japan's door. If Tsushima fell, the invasion fleet would have a forward base for attacking the Japanese mainland. The island's defense rested on the shoulders of one man, So Sukekuni, who had governed Tsushima for 20 years. At 68 years old, the grey-bearded samurai had earned his nickname the Immovable Rock through decades of unwavering service. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Sukekuni knew exactly what was coming. Korean traders had whispered warnings for months. They fight like demons, not men, one merchant told him. They use the Chinese thunder weapons. They coordinate with drums and flags. They don't seek honor, they seek only victory. The Mongol military machine combined the best of 3 conquered civilizations. Chinese engineers provided gunpowder weapons and siegecraft. Korean shipbuilders created vessels that could transport thousands of warriors across treacherous seas. And Mongol commanders brought tactics that had conquered half the known world: coordinated cavalry charges, psychological warfare, and a complete disregard for enemy traditions. Meanwhile, samurai culture revolved around individual combat. For centuries, battles began with formal challenges, ancestral lineages shouted across fields, and single combat between worthy opponents. A samurai's glory came from facing enemies one-on-one, demonstrating superior swordsmanship and dying with honor if defeated. They trained for duels, not coordinated assault. Think about that for a moment. 80 versus 8,000. Yet Sukekuni gathered his men at Komodahama Beach, the island's main landing site. He could have retreated inland, fought a guerrilla campaign, made the Mongols pay for every foot of ground. Instead, he chose to meet them on the beach, in open combat, according to samurai tradition. The Mongol force approaching Tsushima represented something unprecedented in Japanese experience. Led by battle-hardened generals like Liu Fuheng and Hong Dagu, veterans of campaigns across China, this wasn't just an army, it was an invasion machine. 25,000 warriors total, with 8,000 designated for Tsushima alone. But fate had one more cruel twist. Among the invasion force were Korean soldiers, forced to fight for their conquerors. Some knew Sukekuni personally from years of trade. The night before the invasion, A Korean officer risked execution to send one final warning: abandon the beach. They will not duel you. They will not show mercy. They will sweep over you like a tide. Sukekuni's response revealed everything about the samurai spirit. I have been governor here for 20 years. My father held this post, and his father before him. We don't abandon our duty because the enemy doesn't follow our customs. As October turned to November, prayer smoke rose from every shrine on Tsushima. Mothers clutched children, wives sharpened knives, not for defense, but for a faster death than capture. The island held its breath. But how do you prepare for an enemy that breaks every rule of war you've ever known? Dawn on November 5th revealed the full scope of the invasion. 900 ships blackened the horizon. Junks, warships, transports, supply vessels stretching beyond sight. The Mongol armada carried 8,000 warriors designated for Tsushima alone, part of a 25,000-strong invasion force aimed at Japan. Then something happened that changed warfare forever. As Korean translators aboard the ships shouted final surrender demands, samurai scouts noticed strange objects being unloaded. Ceramic pots, bronze spheres, tubes mounted on wooden frames. The Japanese had no words for these devices. Within hours, they would know them by their sound, the thunder crash bombs that would shatter not just bodies, but an entire way of war. The technology gap between the forces defied measurement. Mongol composite bows could kill at 350 meters, while samurai bows barely reached 200. But it wasn't just range. Mongol arrows came in varieties the Japanese had never seen. Some whistled as they flew, terrifying horses. Others carried poison that paralyzed victims within minutes. Most devastating were the fire arrows, wrapped in oil-soaked cloth that couldn't be extinguished with water. Against this technological terror stood 80 mounted samurai. Each warrior represented generations of martial tradition. Their armor, passed down through families, consisted of layered leather and iron plates that could deflect sword strikes, but would prove useless against Mongol innovations. They carried ancestral katanas, some forged centuries earlier, blessed at shrines and named for legendary victories. Let me paint you a picture of the commanders. So Sukekuni sat astride his warhorse, his grey beard flowing over armor that had protected his family for generations. Beside him, his adopted son Sukesada gripped his bow with hands that had never known defeat in single combat. Young samurai like Hyoe Suketoki had rushed from nearby estates, some barely old enough to complete their warrior training. On the Mongol side, commanders Liu Fuheng and Hong Dagu studied the beach through Chinese telescopes, another technology the Japanese had never encountered. Veterans of campaigns across China, they had perfected the art of amphibious assault. Their battle plan utilized tactics refined through conquering fortified cities and crushing armies far larger than the token force awaiting them. Here's the detail that still haunts historians. The Mongols assigned just 1/10 of their Tsushima force to the initial landing. 800 warriors would be more than enough for 80 defenders. The rest would land afterward to begin the systematic subjugation of the island. Sasu no Ura Bay offered the perfect landing site, a crescent beach with deep water access for the ships and narrow approaches that traditionally would favor defenders. But Mongol commanders had studied the terrain through Korean informants. They knew every cliff path, every shrine location, every village position. The night before battle, Sukekuni gathered his men at the Kaijin shrine overlooking the bay. Incense smoke mixed with mist as warriors performed ritual purification. Some wrote death poems. Others sent final messages with the few merchants fleeing inland. A young samurai named Shiro spent the night teaching his 12-year-old brother how to commit seppuku properly, should capture seem imminent. But the Mongols brought something no sword could counter: psychological warfare perfected across continents. As dawn approached, war drums began pounding from the ships. Not the rhythmic beats Japanese warriors knew, but chaotic, thunderous noise designed to unnerve enemies. Mongol soldiers clashed weapons against shields in unison, creating waves of metallic thunder that rolled across the water. What happened next would shatter 1,000 years of tradition. As the first Mongol boats approached shore, young samurai rode to the water's edge to issue formal challenges. They called out their lineages, their victories, demanding worthy opponents for single combat. The response came in the form of coordinated arrow volleys that cut down men mid-sentence. Remember this detail: the Mongols had specific orders. No negotiations, no delays, no acknowledgement of Japanese customs. Total victory by sunset. As Sukekuni watched his young warriors fall to massed archery, he understood the true nature of his enemy. This wasn't war as samurai knew it. This was extermination disguised as conquest. But retreat meant abandoning civilians to slaughter. The samurai code demanded they stand between the invaders and the innocent. As dawn broke on November 5th, the horizon turned black with ships, and 80 men prepared to buy time with their lives. The morning mist lifted like a theatre curtain, revealing the full horror of what approached Tsushima. Ships emerged from the fog like dragons from the deep, their red banners snapping in the wind, drums pounding in alien rhythms. The lead vessels launched scout boats, each packed with archers. The first deaths came swiftly. A small samurai patrol rode to challenge the scouts, calling out formal declarations of combat. Arrows fell like rain. Not the single, aimed shots of honorable archery, but coordinated volleys that blackened the sky. No survivors. The scouts hadn't even slowed their rowing. Here's where honor met its match. As more boats ground onto the beach, samurai riders charged forward individually, seeking glory through single combat. A warrior named Saito no Goro rode straight at the landing boats, shouting his ancestry, demanding the enemy's greatest warrior face him. 40 arrows struck him simultaneously. His horse collapsed into the surf, blood turning the foam pink. You can almost hear the thundering hooves as more samurai attempted traditional charges. But the Mongols had perfected anti-cavalry tactics across the steppes of Asia. They formed shield walls using portable barriers, creating a wooden fortress on the beach. Behind these shields, crossbowmen reloaded while the front rank fired. It was mechanical, efficient, and utterly alien to Japanese warfare. Then came a sound no Japanese warrior had ever heard. The first thunder crash bomb exploded among the defending cavalry. The ceramic pot, filled with gunpowder and metal fragments, detonated with a roar that sent horses rearing in terror. Samurai who had never flinched from sword combat found themselves fighting panicked mounts as more explosions followed. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Warriors who had prepared their whole lives for honorable death by blade found themselves facing something that made courage irrelevant. You couldn't challenge a bomb to single combat. You couldn't parry an explosion with ancestral techniques. Sukekuni watched from his command position as traditional deployment collapsed within minutes. Multiple landing points spread his small force impossibly thin. Mongol officers used signal flags to coordinate movements, while Japanese defenders relied on shouted commands lost in the chaos. Every samurai fought as an individual hero. Every Mongol fought as part of a machine. By the second hour, the technology gap became a chasm. Mongol troops advanced under cover of suppressing fire, a concept that wouldn't reach European battlefields for centuries. When samurai cavalry charged, Korean auxiliaries threw lime powder that blinded horses and riders. Chinese engineers launched incendiary projectiles that set defensive positions ablaze. What followed next defied every code of samurai honor. As the governor's nephew, Michiari, rode out to challenge the Mongol commander to personal combat, enemy troops simply surrounded him. No acknowledgement of his challenge, no respect for his courage. They pulled him from his horse with hooked poles and butchered him like livestock while he screamed about honor and ancestry. The poisoned arrows revealed themselves next. A samurai named Yasuda took a grazing hit to his shoulder, the kind of wound warriors typically ignored. Within minutes, his arm went numb, then his chest. He toppled from his horse, paralyzed but conscious, watching helplessly as Mongol infantry approached with their swords. The poison didn't kill, it just removed the ability to die fighting. Can you imagine the terror of that first explosion? Samurai trained to face death found themselves confronting something beyond their philosophy. The thunder crash bombs didn't just kill, they made the very air dangerous. Smoke choked warriors inside their helmets. Concussion waves knocked men senseless without touching them. Horses trained for battle went mad with fear. This is the moment that haunts me as a historian. Sukekuni realized his tactical position was hopeless, but duty chained him to the beach. Behind him, thousands of civilians depended on whatever time his sacrifice could purchase. He could hear the panic spreading through nearby villages as runners brought news of each position overrun. The Mongols systematically reduced each defensive pocket. They didn't seek glory or individual combat. They sought only efficiency. Shield walls advanced in lockstep. Arrows fell in coordinated volleys. Signal flags turned 800 men into a single organism with one purpose: complete annihilation of resistance. But it was the poisoned arrows that truly terrified them. The toxin, derived from wolfsbane and other plants, caused progressive paralysis. Warriors watched their sword arms fail, their legs buckle, their ability to even speak the names of their ancestors fade. Death came not from honorable blade work, but from Mongol auxiliaries methodically executing the helpless. By midday, the beaches ran red, and Sukekuni made a decision that would echo through eternity. He gathered his remaining men, perhaps 30 still mounted, another 20 on foot. The beach defense had failed. The Mongols controlled multiple landing sites. Traditional tactics had proven worthless against coordinated firepower. But Sukekuni wasn't finished. If he couldn't stop the invasion, he could at least die in a way that would be remembered. He would lead one final charge, not for victory, but for the very soul of samurai honor. As explosions rocked the air and arrows darkened the sky, the last defenders of Tsushima prepared for their final act. The Komoda Beach disaster unfolded like a nightmare made real. 25 samurai, the cream of Tsushima's warriors, formed up for a traditional cavalry charge against the Mongol center. They rode in perfect formation, war cries echoing off the cliffs, swords gleaming in the afternoon sun. The Mongols waited behind their shield wall, patient as spiders. At 50 meters, the arrow storm began, not individual shots but a solid wall of projectiles. Horses screamed and tumbled. Warriors who had spent decades perfecting their swordsmanship died without ever reaching blade range. Those who survived the arrows met something worse. Metal shields that deflected katana strikes, spearmen who worked in teams, surrounding and slaughtering challengers like cattle in a pen. The gunpowder terror reached new heights. Chinese engineers brought forward bronze tubes mounted on wooden frames, primitive cannons that launched thunder crash bombs deeper into Japanese positions. Each explosion sent dirt and bodies flying. Horses refused to advance toward the alien thunder. Some samurai dismounted, preferring to die on foot rather than fight their terrified mounts. But individual heroics still blazed through the chaos. Sukesada, the governor's adopted son, made his stand near the coastal shrine. As Mongols overran his position, he planted his banner and fought with supernatural fury. Contemporary accounts credit him with killing 25 enemies. He switched from bow to spear to sword, as each weapon broke or lodged in enemy bodies. When Mongol soldiers finally brought him down, they found 17 arrows in his armor. He had simply refused to fall. Young warriors experiencing their first and last battle died with desperate courage. A teenager named Taro, barely 16, held a bridge over a tidal stream until Mongol crossbowmen turned him into a pincushion. His death bought fleeing civilians precious minutes. Another youth, Jiro, already poisoned and knowing death approached, charged alone into a Mongol formation to die on his feet, rather than paralyzed on his back. This is when honor became a liability. The Mongol tactics evolved throughout the day, learning and adapting. They noticed how samurai would break formation to aid fallen comrades, so they began wounding warriors deliberately, creating bait. They observed how Japanese warriors announced themselves before attacking, so they stationed archers to target anyone who stopped to speak. Signal coordination from clifftops turned the battle into a choreographed slaughter. Mongol observers used flags to direct troops toward weak points, coordinate flanking movements, and time artillery strikes. The systematic beach-by-beach advance resembled an industrial process more than traditional warfare. Each position fell in sequence. Scouts identified defenders, artillery softened resistance, infantry swept in for the kill. The poison arrow's effect multiplied the horror. Paralyzed warriors lay helpless as battle raged around them. Some begged comrades for mercy killings rather than face capture. Others watched their friends die while they could only move their eyes. The growing pile of samurai bodies created obstacles that channeled surviving defenders into kill zones. What happened in the next hour defied belief. The shrine defense turned into a massacre. 30 samurai made their stand at the Kaijin shrine, holy ground their families had protected for centuries. Mongol troops showed no respect for the sacred space. They set the wooden structures ablaze with fire arrows, shooting down defenders as they fled the flames. The head priest died trying to save religious scrolls, burning alive rather than abandoning his duty. But fate wasn't done with its cruel jokes. As positions crumbled, civilians began appearing on the battlefield. Women and children fled burning villages, seeking protection that no longer existed. Some samurai tried to guide them to safety, breaking from combat to shepherd the helpless. Mongol cavalry rode them down without distinction. A mother carrying an infant took an arrow meant for the samurai trying to protect her. Both died in the sand. The next few minutes would shatter a millennium of tradition. A group of elder samurai, all over 60, formed a final square near the governor's position. These men had served Sukekuni's father, some even his grandfather. They planted their banners and prepared for a last stand worthy of their ancestors. Mongol commanders didn't even slow down. They simply ordered concentrated bombardment. Thunder crash bombs reduced the square to crater and corpses. The messenger's escape attempt added another layer of tragedy. A young samurai named Hiko tried to break through Mongol lines, carrying intelligence about the invasion force. He rode the fastest horse on Tsushima, took a circuitous route through forests he'd known since childhood. Mongol scouts tracked him using Korean hunting dogs. They found his body 3 miles inland, still clutching the message, describing the horror unfolding on the beaches. But here's where the battle took its darkest turn. As sunset approached, Sukekuni surveyed the devastation. Of his 80 samurai, perhaps 20 remained combat effective. Bodies littered the beach, some killed cleanly by arrows, others mangled by explosions, many paralyzed by poison and executed where they lay. The governor's war council consisted of whoever could still hold a weapon. This is the moment that changed everything. Sukekuni could have retreated inland, conducted a fighting withdrawal, perhaps survived another day. Instead, he chose something that would echo through centuries. He would lead one final charge, not for victory, but to show the Mongols that samurai spirit couldn't be broken by superior numbers or technology. "Form up," he commanded his surviving men. Those who could still ride mounted horses. Those whose mounts had died stood ready to charge on foot. Some bore wounds that would have sent lesser men seeking medical aid. One samurai, named Tadashi, had lost 3 fingers to a Mongol sword, but wrapped the stumps and gripped his katana with his remaining hand. The Mongols had barely begun their demonstration. As Sukekuni's tiny force assembled, enemy commanders organized their troops for what they assumed would be a simple mop-up operation. They had faced desperate last charges before in China, in Korea. They knew how to handle them. Mass archery, overlapping fields of fire, no heroics. But the true nightmare was just beginning. Behind the military forces, Mongol auxiliaries had started the systematic reduction of civilian areas. Fishing villages burned. Smoke columns rose across Tsushima as the invasion force spread beyond the beaches. The screams of non-combatants mixed with the clash of weapons. Sukekuni raised his ancestral sword, the blade his great-grandfather had carried, which had never known defeat in honorable combat. Around him, 20 men prepared to charge into certain death. They knew no songs would be sung of their victory. They knew no reinforcements were coming. They knew their families would likely die before the sun fully set. "For Tsushima!" Sukekuni shouted. "For Japan! For honor!" The last charge of the last samurai of the old world began as the sun touched the horizon. 21 men, some mounted, some on foot, all wounded, all doomed, charged into 2,000 Mongol warriors. They didn't charge for victory. They charged because it was what samurai did. They charged because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. They charged because dying with a sword in hand was the only ending their code allowed. The Mongols were ready. Arrows darkened the sky. Thunder crash bombs exploded among the charging samurai. Horses fell. Men died. But still they came. Those who survived the initial barrage, crashing into Mongol lines with the fury of men who had accepted death and wanted only to make it meaningful. Sukekuni himself made it furthest, cutting down 3 Mongols before a Chinese pike found his chest. He fell from his horse but struggled to his feet, still swinging his ancestral blade until multiple arrows brought him to his knees. The governor of Tsushima died as he had lived, facing his enemies, defending his people, refusing to yield. The sun set on that blood-soaked beach, painting the sky red to match the sand. In 6 hours, 1,000 years of tradition had died. The age of honorable single combat, of warrior codes and ancestral swords determining battles, had ended with thunder and smoke. But the horror wasn't over. As the last samurai fell, the true atrocity was just beginning. The last samurai fell, as darkness claimed Tsushima. Sukekuni's body lay where he'd made his final stand, surrounded by his men who had followed him into death. The Mongol victory was complete. 80 samurai eliminated, organized resistance shattered, the island defenseless. But what followed would make their worst nightmares seem merciful. Victory rituals began immediately. Mongol tradition demanded trophies, and they took them efficiently. Heads were removed from fallen samurai, particularly those who had fought with distinction. Sukekuni's head, grey-bearded and dignified even in death, was cleaned and prepared for shipment to Kublai Khan as proof of conquest. But mere military trophies wouldn't satisfy what came next. The atrocity began with the women. As Mongol forces spread through the island, they encountered civilians who had nowhere to flee. Women of samurai families, raised with dignity and honor, found themselves facing a fate worse than death. Many chose suicide rather than capture, using the knives their husbands had left them. Mothers killed their children first, then themselves, rather than see them enslaved. Then came the ship decorations that would haunt Japanese memory forever. This wasn't random brutality. It was calculated psychological warfare. Mongol commanders ordered specific preparations for a message that would sail to the Japanese mainland. Women and children who hadn't escaped were gathered at the beach. What happened next violated every concept of warfare the Japanese understood. The Mongols drove metal spikes through the palms of their captives, not to kill, but to create mounting points. Living victims were stripped and hung from the hulls of ships like human flags. The screaming carried across the water as vessels prepared to sail for Iki Island, and eventually the mainland. Some victims survived for hours in this position, their agony serving as Mongol banners. This detail will chill you to the bone. Korean auxiliaries later reported that Mongol commanders specifically chose women and children who resembled Japanese nobility. They wanted mainland samurai to see their own families reflected in the tortured faces hanging from ship hulls. It wasn't just conquest. It was a message written in human suffering. The death toll mounted relentlessly. 80 samurai had died in battle, but over 6,000 civilians would perish in the following days. Fishing villages burned. Farmers were executed in their fields. Monks died defending their temples. The systematic slaughter served a strategic purpose. Complete depopulation meant no guerrilla resistance, no support for any Japanese counterattack. What the Mongols did next defied all expectations of warfare. Mass executions weren't random. They followed patterns. Fighting-age men died first, eliminated as potential threats. Women faced slavery, or worse. Children were sorted, some killed immediately, others reserved for slavery. The elderly were executed as useless mouths to feed. Even livestock was slaughtered to deny resources to any survivors. But here's what makes this battle truly terrifying. A few witnesses survived, hidden in caves and forests. A fisherman named Goto watched from a cliff as his village was surrounded and systematically destroyed. He saw neighbors he'd known his entire life herded onto the beach and executed in groups. He heard his own family's screams, but could do nothing except bear witness. A Buddhist monk named Tenshin survived by hiding in a root cellar beneath his temple. He emerged days later to find his fellow monks dead. The temple burned, religious artifacts destroyed. His written account, smuggled to the mainland, described scenes that seemed impossible. They hung the living from their ships like cruel banners. The bay ran red with blood. The screaming continued day and night until voices failed. The Mongols' efficiency in securing the island proved remarkable. Within 1 day, they had eliminated military resistance. Within 3 days, they had effectively depopulated the coastline. Supply depots were established. Wounded were treated using Chinese medical knowledge. Ships were repaired and resupplied for the next phase of invasion. Personal tragedies multiplied beyond counting. A samurai widow named Tomoe returned from inland to find her husband's headless body and her children missing, likely among those hung from ships. A merchant discovered his entire extended family executed in their compound. A young boy found his samurai father's body and tried to retrieve the family sword, only to be cut down by Mongol sentries. Here's the moment that haunts historians. The ships sailed for Iki Island, with their grotesque cargo still alive. Witnesses on Iki reported seeing the vessels approach with what appeared to be decorations on their hulls. Only as they drew closer did the horrific truth become clear. Human beings, still moving, their agony serving as psychological warfare against the next target. The warning to Japan couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't traditional warfare between honorable enemies. This was systematic extermination by an empire that had perfected the art of conquest. The ships sailing from Tsushima carried more than troops and supplies. They carried a message written in suffering. Surrender or share Tsushima's fate. The ending was more horrific than anyone imagined. Of Tsushima's coastal population, perhaps 1 in 10 survived by fleeing inland or hiding. The rest died in violence or were carried away to slavery. The island that had been Japan's forward defense became a Mongol staging ground, its beaches still littered with samurai bodies that no one remained to bury. But Tsushima was merely the first note in a symphony of invasion, one that would end in ways the Mongols never imagined. The immediate impact rippled across the Japanese islands like a tsunami. Iki Island fell next, suffering a similar fate despite desperate resistance. The race to Hakata Bay began as terrified refugees spread word of Mongol brutality. Japan had days, not weeks, to prepare for an enemy that had shattered every military assumption they held. The tactical revolution started immediately. Tsushima taught harsh lessons written in blood. Honorable single combat meant nothing against coordinated units. Traditional challenges became death sentences. Cavalry charges against disciplined infantry with gunpowder weapons equaled suicide. The samurai way of war, refined over centuries, had become obsolete in 6 hours. Japanese commanders, learning from Tsushima's agony, began radical adaptations. Stone walls rose at Hakata Bay, not the wooden palisades of traditional warfare, but massive fortifications designed to break cavalry charges. New tactics emphasized group fighting over individual glory. Samurai learned to fight in units, supporting each other rather than seeking personal honor. But it was divine intervention, not military evolution, that saved Japan. The Kamikaze, divine wind, struck the Mongol fleet as it prepared for the mainland invasion. Ships that had carried tortured civilians from Tsushima were shattered by typhoon winds. Thousands of Mongol warriors drowned, their advanced weapons useless against nature's fury. Yet Tsushima's sacrifice wasn't in vain. The warning provided by those 80 samurai, and the civilians who died after them, gave Japan precious time. Time to build walls, time to adapt tactics, time to prepare spiritually and militarily for an enemy unlike any they'd faced. When the Mongols returned in 1281 with an even larger force, Japan was ready. The long-term changes proved profound. Japanese military thinking transformed from individual heroics to collective defense. Gunpowder weapons, captured from Mongol forces, were studied and eventually reproduced. The psychological shock of facing an enemy who ignored battlefield conventions prepared Japan for future conflicts where honor took second place to survival. Modern parallels resonate strongly. When technology obsoletes tradition, adaptation or extinction are the only choices. The samurai faced this choice in hours, not years. Their individual courage couldn't overcome coordinated firepower. Their honor codes became tactical weaknesses. Yet they fought anyway, buying time with their lives. Think about this philosophical question. When does honor demand adaptation versus adherence to tradition? Sukekuni chose to fight traditionally, knowing it meant certain death. His sacrifice warned Japan but doomed his men. Could pragmatism have saved more lives? Or would abandoning samurai ideals have meant a spiritual defeat worse than physical death? What would you do in Sukekuni's position? Face certain death with traditional honor, or adapt tactics and possibly survive longer? History doesn't judge. It simply records that 80 men chose to die as they had lived, as samurai. The memory endures because Tsushima represents a universal moment, when the old world meets the new and must choose between evolution and extinction. Every military revolution creates its Tsushima moments. Every technological leap leaves traditions obsolete. Every generation faces the choice: adapt or die, with honor intact. 80 men who knew they would die chose to die as samurai, and in doing so, gave Japan the warning that saved an empire. They couldn't stop the Mongol military machine, but they showed it to Japan. They paid in blood for intelligence that would preserve their nation. In the end, that may be the greatest victory possible for warriors facing impossible odds, to make their deaths matter. Their sacrifice echoes through 7.5 centuries, reminding us that sometimes the price of warning is everything you have to give.